Steve Jobs once said that people don't know what they want until you show it to them. Jobs has produced new products that consumers discovered they really, really wanted.
Not many people enjoy absolute worldwide fame in their lives. The extent to which some people affect the world is so great that it's impossible to imagine a world without them. The same can be said for Steve Jobs. He has single-handedly changed the world of technology, and no one questions that. The American businessman invented some of the greatest devices of all time, including the iPhone, iPad, and the MacBook. Not many people know this, but Steve hasn't just contributed to the world of technology. He's also one of the masterminds behind some of the movies that we all love. Why? Because he was also one of the board members at Disney and a shareholder for the animation company Pixar. Steve's contributions to the world aren't just limited to his own, largely successful company, Apple Incorporated. But even after his death, his company Apple continues to be one of the richest corporations in the entire world, churning out new products within the blink of an eye. According to Forbes, if Steve was alive today, his net worth would have been about $31.6 billion. That's a big number, isn't it? But how exactly did Steve go from a middle-class high school dropout to one of the greatest minds of our time? It wasn't easy, that's for sure. Steve suffered endless setbacks during his career. His innovations were initially rejected by multiple companies, and he was told that he needed to stop dreaming so big. But under his reign, Apple went on to become the benchmark for science and technology. Even years after Steve's death, his legacy still lives on. Some people say that it will live on forever because Apple isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Steve Jobs was born on February 24th in an Arab Muslim household belonging to Homs, Syria. This is something not a lot of people know about. His biological mother gave birth to him in San Francisco. Steve was then adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs after a little bit of a struggle with Steve's adoptive mom.
So everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer and his wife. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute that they really wanted a girl.
Steve grew up in a very happy home with his parents and sister Patricia. He was a bright, funny child who would light up any room he was in. His father, Paul, was a mechanic. It was through him that Steve was first introduced to the world of inventions. He would spend hours experimenting with electronics, which contributed to his lifelong interest in the same field. But while Steve was mastering the art of technology and mechanics, he was having a hard time keeping up at school. Even though he was a smart kid, he was a bit of a troublemaker. His teachers literally had to bribe him to make him study.
Steve Wozniak and I, mostly Steve, made this little device called a TV jammer. And it was this little oscillator that would put out frequencies that would screw up the TV.
After high school, Steve went to Reed College in Portland. He was there for 6 months before dropping out, but he recalls that the courses that he loved taking were the creative ones, such as typography, that later inspired his design approach with Apple products. In 1974, Jobs started working as a video game designer for the company Atari. However, he left the job a few months later to travel and find some sort of peace and enlightenment. Upon returning back in 1976, he collaborated with his longtime friend Steve Wozniak and started their company, Apple Computers.
I just did it for fun. It was a hobby, and I wanted my own computer. I told my dad at one point, someday I'm going to have this particular computer of my own. And he said, how are you going to do that? It costs as much as a house.
The duo designed and sold quite a few computers, and the venture expanded considerably within a few years. Their series of user-friendly computers earned the company around $139 million. By 1980, Apple Computers had a market value of $1.2 billion. But things started to go downhill from there. The company started losing sales and customers because of a couple of failed products. Then, in 1984, Jobs released the first-ever Macintosh, or what we now know and love as the MacBook, that was marketed as a milestone in home computing. Despite the computer's success among the people, it still wasn't enough to compete with IBM.
We're making mistakes, we're fixing them as fast as we can, and what happens sometimes, though, is that some people lie.
But this affected Steve more than it affected the entire company. The executive board at Apple believed that Steve was hurting Apple's sales. He had been using up their money to create products that turned out to be failures. They didn't want to fire Steve, so they decided to give him less and less control over what products the company released. Because of this marginalization, Jobs decided to quit Apple in 1985. He has said on numerous occasions that quitting Apple was a good decision that helped him gain perspective about what he wanted to do in terms of his career.
You know, I can't see when you do that. Thanks. So maybe later, could we do some more? That really helped me.
Steve tried his hand at starting a new business once again with the hardware and software enterprise called Next.
Ultimately, I think the customers are the parents. Not even the students, but the parents. The problem that we have in this country is that the customers went away.
Eventually, Apple bought the company in 1996, and a year later, Steve returned to Apple as the CEO. This return proved to be game-changing for both Steve and Apple. With Steve's brilliant ideas and captivating branding campaigns, Apple was reaching new heights. Within a couple of years, Steve changed the face of technology by introducing revolutionary products like the iPod, iPhone, and MacBook Air.
An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. This is one device, and we are calling it iPhone.
But even though Steve was enjoying absolute success with his company, things were a little complicated behind the scenes. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2003. He initially declined any surgery.
He tries to treat it with diet. He goes to spiritualists. He goes to various ways of doing it macrobiotically, and he doesn't get an operation.
This created a little havoc within Apple because the company thought they would lose shareholders if news of Steve's illness was leaked somehow, but Steve managed to keep things secretive. In 2004, he finally went through a successful surgery. What's crazy is that no one knew about any of this till 2009 when Steve disclosed it himself. But Steve recovered well, and by 2007, Apple had made a record-breaking profit of $1.58 billion and had zero debt. The enterprise was rated #1 on Fortune magazine's list of most desired companies. Steve's new approach was to design products that weren't overly complicated. He was aiming to design things that would be easy to use and useful for the masses. He managed to put out such innovative pieces of technology that Apple quickly surpassed Microsoft in the market. Pretty crazy considering the fact that Apple is now one of the biggest names all over the world. Other than his success in the world of tech, Steve also dived into the world of film and animation. He invested nearly $50 million in the company Pixar simply because he believed in them. And it worked out. Under Steve's ownership, the company released several groundbreaking films such as Toy Story,
it. Sorry there, old spudhead. Mission accomplished. Well done, man. Pack it up. We're going home.
Finding Nemo,
It's not safe.
Nemo! No!
Dad?
Ugh, you're about to swim into open water.
No, I wasn't
It's just a
gonna
good...
and The Incredibles.
We're superheroes. What can happen?
Married to Laureen Powell and father of 3 children, Reed, Aaron, and Eve, Steve's life was as good as it gets. But sadly, he didn't get to enjoy the fruits of his labor for long. By 2009, Steve's health had started to deteriorate. Even the fans noticed it. He went through a liver transplant and had to take a 6-month leave of absence from work. But even after that, Jobs was in no shape to continue his usual career. Finally, in 2011, he admitted that his health did not allow him to head the company anymore. In August, he resigned as the CEO of Apple and handed his company over to his dear friend, Tim Cook. The announcement came as a shock to people all over the world, but everything made sense when Steve Jobs sadly passed away on October 5, 2011, after his long battle with pancreatic cancer. According to his sister Mona, Steve's final words before he died were, "Oh wow," sort of the perfect ending to his life. The entire world grieved for the man who had given us so much, but stayed with us for such a short time. Steve Jobs has died, but the legacy he has left behind is massive. His name still lives on as one of the most brilliant designers of all time. Despite his rocky childhood, unstable career, and deteriorating health, he reached heights most people can't even dream of. it won't be wrong to say that the name of Steve Jobs will perhaps never die. If there's one thing for sure, watching Steve Jobs turn his disadvantages into his superpowers was a sight to be witnessed, and the products he developed will certainly go down in history.